So, for anybody that's been in the custom computer space for some time, has more likely heard of the legendary chip, the i5-2500K. This chip has now hit its 10-year birthday, being launched initially back in 2011 at about $200. This chip can now be found around $35 used on eBay and the like, and I've always kind of had a curiosity of how well this performs or holds up, and if people could still actually use it given the year is now 2021. So originally this video was going to be a bit simpler. It was just going to be me benchmarking the 2500K in a multitude of newer titles to see if it held up. But as I got my hands on the 2500K, I was also building a system which is the Ryzen 5 1600AF paired with the GTX 1070. And since I was going to plan on pairing the 2500K with a card relatively similar to a GTX 1070 anyway, I thought it might be a little bit more interesting comparing a newer chip that is the more, I guess you would say, budget value chip of its day to the older budget value chip of its day to see quite the difference 10 years could make. So just to go over my testing methodology to get that out of the way, whenever I'm comparing two CPUs or I'm testing to see if a CPU is limiting the GPU in any sort of way, I go into my games and try and adjust the settings so that the GPU is not at 100%. I'll let it go maybe 90, 85%, somewhere around there, basically just to show that the CPU is what's limiting the FPS numbers and the performance, so that swapping out the CPU will actually show you results that are different rather than just showing what the GPU can do at 100%. So with that said, I took a multitude of games, some of them newer, some of them older, most of them kind of popular titles, and then compare the 2500K to the Ryzen 5 1600AF. Also, keep in mind that the 1600AF is basically just a Ryzen 5 2600, so if the performance numbers reflect that more, it's because it's the AF version and not the regular 1600. I left the Ryzen 5 1600 at stock settings, which obviously isn't a fair fight when you're comparing the two, because the Ryzen 5 1600 is an unlocked chip which allows you to get a much bigger performance boost by putting a better cooler on it and bumping up the voltage. It's the same with the 2500K, but obviously, since we're trying to make it even remotely fair, the 2500K is going to be overclocked to 4.6 gigahertz. That was the most stable that I could get this particular chip. I wasn't really running into thermal problems, but anything above 4.6, I would have to bump the voltage up to 1.5, and at that point, you're riding the razor's edge of actually damaging your chip. So 4.6 is what I actually ended up with, and I think that's a reasonable overclock for this kind of chip. But this is to try and show if you're running a 2500K in your system currently and you're thinking of upgrading, how much is it to just simply upgrade to a stock Ryzen chip that's fairly affordable at this point, and how beneficial will it be to you? So I'll try and reveal the actual benchmark numbers in some sort of way where it isn't just an absolute bloodbath. So we're going to start off with just kind of showcasing the raw difference between the two chips. The 2500K is a 4-core, 4-thread chip, so you have to keep that in mind when doing CPU-specific things such as Cinebench or the CPU score in 3D Mark. Whenever you're doing something that relies heavily on the CPU, no matter how fast you can get this 2500K to go in clock speed, it is only running on 4 cores versus the 12 threads that the Ryzen 5 1600 has available. So the first simulated benchmark that I'm going to compare is the 3D Mark times by CPU score. Obviously we got the exact same GPU score on both runs because it is legitimately the exact same GPU. But for the i5 2500K, we got a CPU score of 2,552, which in my opinion is a little bit low, and then switching over to the 1600AF, we got a score of 6,235. Now this doesn't mean that the Ryzen 5 1600 is going to perform 3 times better than the 2500K in all applications. This is more focusing towards very CPU heavy loads, such as if you were rendering something out, encoding a file, unzipping something, or doing a CPU heavy load on your computer. So with that initial simulated benchmark out of the way, just to kind of showcase the disparity between the two chips, I moved on to my first game, which ended up being Fortnite. Now I'm running Fortnite at medium settings here. That's where I saw that the GTX 1070 wasn't peaking at 100% all the time, which allowed the CPUs to kind of show a little bit of a difference. that difference being actually pretty minimal, which gave me a little bit of hope that it might be a closer race than I thought. The 2500K got an average of 130 FPS, and the Ryzen 5 1600 got an average of 133. So when I saw this, I was like, hey, maybe there's something to not having to upgrade after 10 years of use. But I'll let you see the rest of the benchmarks and see the conclusion that was slowly made obvious to me after doing those. So on to the second game, which was Rainbow Six Siege, which again is not a new title by any means, but is a very popular game that a lot of people still play. But this is where you can actually see a fair bit of difference between the two chips and starts hinting at the conclusion that we're all pretty much at anyway in our minds. So our itty bitty little 2500K that could came in at 116 frames per second on average, while our Ryzen 5 1600AF came in at 166 frames per second on average. This starts showing the trend line of the 1600AF kind of taking away the lead, and we'll continue to broaden that gap as we go into more games. So now moving into the game that actually probably surprised me the most, which is The Witcher 3. Again, yes, I understand it's an older title. There are more relevant titles in this actual lineup. But The Witcher 3, as I've benchmarked it on a multitude of different systems and all the different computers that I've built, I've seen being a pretty CPU-intensive title, and so I thought it was a good title to run through since we're comparing CPUs. So with the little run that I do, I got 30 frames per second average with the 2500K, which, again, the game is set to Ultra for this testing, but it's kind of because it's an old game, and running it on Ultra isn't the hardest thing in the world. But the fact that the 2500K could not keep up with the demand of the GTX 1070 is just really showing that the 2500K might be heading out the door here soon, because the Ryzen 5 1600AF allowed a average frames per second in The Witcher 3 at 91 frames per second average, which is a huge difference. It's actually close to that 3 times performance that we were looking at with the synthetic benchmark, and so if that game doesn't make it clear, we'll keep moving on to more. So the newest title on this list of benchmarks that I ran is Cyberpunk 2077. Being another very CPU intensive title and being very new, I was curious to see if the 2500K could meek out a little bit of something to kind of give it a little bit of hope. But we ended up getting an average frame rate of 42 on Cyberpunk with the 2500K. This is at roughly medium settings with the Cyberpunk 2077, and then switching over to the Ryzen 5 1600AF, we got an average frame rate of 59 frames per second, so not as big of a difference between The Witcher 3 with the two CPUs, but still a sizable difference showing that the 2500K is struggling to give you a good or decent experience at this point, which I do not hold against it by any means. The 2500K certainly deserves its legendary status in the PC building community. It is 10 years old at this point, trying to compete with CPUs that have far beyond surpassed what this little CPU ever imagined it was trying to fight against. So the fact that we're even talking about the 2500K here in 2021 and that it's even remotely relevant is a very good testament to its actual performance and value and its mythical aura of legend. But to finish this off here, I use GTA 5 to benchmark a lot of my different systems. Again, it has a built-in benchmark. A lot of people use it, so I find it a good tool to run CPUs through. So with the 2500K, again, we're running it at 4.6 gigahertz overclock. We got an average frame rate of 60, while with the Ryzen 5 1600AF, we got an average frame rate of 106. Also, again, keep in mind, the Ryzen 5 1600AF is not being overclocked in this scenario, and so if you really wanted to get higher frame rates than that while not spending any more money, you could simply just overclock the Ryzen 5 1600AF and give it a fair fight comparing it to the 2500K. So now at this point, you may be asking yourself why I made a video just to thrash on the 2500K and showing it getting beat over the head again and again by a much more superior CPU at this point. And the reason that I kind of wanted to go through all of this and show you the numbers and talk about the 2500K in general is it's dropped down to a $35 price point. And getting any sort of CPU that can perform fairly well under $50 is actually a very tempting offer to most. And when you're talking about PC flipping and the kind of business that I run, it might be a pretty cool chip to use periodically or setting up a certain build around if the price is right. The issue with this theory, and the reason that I wanted to really get a hands-on of it and run my own numbers and get a feel for it, is buying a secondhand motherboard that allows you to overclock older Intel chips, such as the Z68 motherboard that we're using here today, is rather expensive considering their age. Picking up a B450 board right now to running a Ryzen chip could run you anywhere from $50, $60, $70, $80, somewhere in that price range if you look for good deals and stuff. And that's buying them new, which comes with a few different benefits, but keep that in mind. Buying this used Z68, which was probably the best deal that I could find in the couple of days, in about a week that I was looking for boards to actually do this video with, this board cost me $60, and that's used with, it's working, but it may not work in the little used category. So the fact that you have to pay $60 for an old board that's going to be outdated rather soon versus spending $60 on the AM4 platform and getting into a system that might last you another 10 or 15 years really shows the weakness in this little idea that I had of trying to bring the 2500K back to life for just a little bit longer. Ultimately, I think you're going to know what my recommendation is before I even say it, but I think the 2500K is not something you should go out and be purchasing now to put into a system. There are better, cheaper options if you're trying to build a very low-end system on a budget. There are better options in general if you're building your first system and you're investing a fair bit of money in it to keep your upgradability still relevant and long-term. So purchasing it here in 2021, I would very strongly disagree with. But if you currently already have a 2500K, or you can pick it up for a better deal than close to the $100 mark that I picked mine up for, then there might still be a little bit of juice left in this thing. If you've been using it since 2011 and you still have it in your system, first off, hats off to you that you haven't upgraded your system in 10 years. I can never go that far. I'm always messing with my computer and wanting to make it better, but if you've been running it and you've been perfectly fine, that's great, and that's honestly super impressive that you've been getting that much value out of a single chip for 10 years. But if you're still using it, honestly, with all the praise of using it for 10 years, I would softly recommend that you might consider upgrading into a different platform, because you're limiting your experience and what you could possibly do with your computer by keeping the 2500K in there. So I think that brings my thoughts to a pretty good closure. I wouldn't be purchasing the 2500K anytime soon unless you want to experiment with it or just have one of the legendary 2500K chips around. They are only $35, so if you do want one, it's not a huge investment, but I wouldn't invest in it if I were you. And then if you are still running the 2500K, hats off to you, but you probably want to start thinking about doing an upgrade at some point in the near future. But that brings all my thoughts to a close. This wasn't really a huge scientific deep dive in the 2500K. It was more just a little experiment, fun thing that I wanted to test out for myself so that I had a little bit more knowledge talking to people about it. So I wanted to pass on that little bit of discovery that I had to you just in case there is any sort of interest on your side with the 2500K. But if you learned something or you liked the video, hit that like button. If you think this was a waste of my money and your time, hit that dislike button. And if you want to learn more about vaguely interesting computer hardware or PC flipping, hit that subscribe button and I will try my best to keep you around. Without further ado, have a good day, guys.